March 23, 1945, 2,100 hours. Eastern bank of the Rhine River, defensive position near Wesel. Major Hans Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army, pressed his field glasses against his face and watched the western bank explode with artillery fire. His hands were steady. In his command log, recovered weeks later from the rubble of a forward headquarters, he wrote, "American bombardment has begun. Standard river assault preparation. We are positioned to repel bridging operations." Quick pause before we continue. If you love uncovering the real battles, secret tactics, and shocking reversals that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and like this video. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how these war stories reach history fans all over the world. Every week we bring you another untold story of courage, innovation, and survival. All right, let's get back to the front lines. The Rhine had never been forced against determined German resistance. Not in 2,000 years. Not without bridges. Not without days of vulnerable engineering work that his 88mm guns could systematically destroy. Model knew this. Every officer along the eastern bank knew this. The river's 1,300-foot width, its swift currents, its open killing fields, these were Germany's last natural fortress, validated by centuries of military history and reinforced by 3 years of Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. Through the gathering darkness, Model observed what he expected: massed artillery preparing the way for what German commanders anticipated would be a traditional crossing operation. Thousands of shells, yes, but then would come the vulnerable phase. The assault boats shuttling back and forth. The engineers bleeding to construct pontoon bridges under fire. The predictable crossing points his artillery had pre-registered.
Time.
The attackers would need time. And time was something the defenders could exploit with brutal efficiency. What Model couldn't see, what no German intelligence officer along the Rhine had properly assessed, were the 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, Black Watch, climbing aboard vehicles that would render every assumption obsolete. Not boats. Not bridging equipment.
Trucks.
Trucks that could swim. The DUKW amphibious vehicles had been observed before. At Normandy. At Sicily. At Salerno. German intelligence reports from those theaters mentioned Schwimmwagen, swimming trucks, exactly as they mentioned American ice cream ships and mobile Coca-Cola bottling plants, curiosities of American industrial excess, irrelevant to serious warfare. Coastal landing craft for beach operations, the analysts concluded. Nothing that could challenge the sanctity of the Rhine. The collapse had begun months earlier, buried in filing cabinets at German intelligence headquarters. Oberstleutnant Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later provide Allied interrogators with a stunning admission about Wehrmacht intelligence assessments. When asked about American amphibious capabilities, Blumentritt described a systematic pattern of dismissal. Reports from multiple theaters mention the strange boat trucks, but German analysts consistently filed them among the oddities of American logistics, specialized equipment with no tactical significance for European river warfare. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had compiled the most comprehensive assessment of Allied equipment in the Western sector. His reports, captured intact when his headquarters fell in April, mention the DUKW exactly 3 times across 6 months of documentation. Each entry classified them as specialized coastal landing vehicles. Each assessment estimated American forces possess perhaps 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theater, concentrated in rear area supply operations. The numbers were catastrophically wrong. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs operated in the European theater alone. The U.S. Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles, trained crews, and developed doctrine for river crossing operations that German intelligence never detected. The British had received an additional 2,000 DUKWs through Lend-Lease, integrating them into their own operational plans with innovations German analysts never imagined. Major Model's division had received intelligence briefings that assured him the Americans would need days to establish a bridgehead. The Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, men who had studied river crossings from the Dnieper to the Seine, believed they understood the immutable mathematics of amphibious assault. Artillery superiority, bridging equipment, vulnerable crossing points.
Time.
But nobody had calculated what would happen if the trucks simply drove across. The Rhine wasn't about to be crossed. It was about to be driven through, as casually as a highway, by vehicles that existed in numbers German intelligence had never conceived possible. And when Major Model finally understood what he was seeing emerging from the dark water, his careful defensive calculations would dissolve into something approaching disbelief. The sound of engines, muffled, strange, moving through water, was already growing louder. This adaptation follows the competitor's flow while maintaining your voice and material. Would you like me to continue with the next section, or would you like adjustments to this opening? The bombardment began at 1800 hours with a precision that bordered on the theatrical. Over 3,500 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously across a 25-mile front, their shells creating a rolling curtain of destruction that turned the western bank of the Rhine into a landscape of fire and smoke. German defenders, huddled in their fortified positions along the eastern bank, recognized the pattern immediately. This was the prelude, the softening. The Americans were preparing to cross, but the crossing itself would come later, after the artillery did its work, after engineers brought forward their bridging equipment, after assault boats assembled at departure points. Major Hans-Georg Model watched the bombardment through his observation post's firing slit and made calculations. The American artillery would fire for hours, perhaps through the night. Then would come the vulnerable phase, when exposed infantry tried to cross in boats while engineers worked frantically to construct pontoon bridges under German fire. That was when his 88mm guns would exact their toll. That was when Wehrmacht defensive doctrine would prove its worth. But something was wrong with the timing. At 2,100 hours, with darkness settling over the river and the artillery still pounding German positions, Model heard a sound that didn't fit the expected pattern. Engines. Not the distant rumble of tanks or the high whine of aircraft, but something closer, muffled, coming from the direction of the water itself. Through his field glasses, he scanned the Rhine's dark surface. The opposite bank was obscured by smoke and lingering artillery haze, but their movement. Not assault boats bobbing in the current. Something larger, moving steadier, cutting through the water with mechanical determination. "Sir," his forward observer reported, voice uncertain. "We have vehicles in the water, not boats. Take us." Model adjusted his glasses. The shapes resolved into something his mind initially rejected. Trucks.
Dozens of them.
Driving through the Rhine as casually as if they were on a highway, their bow waves catching the reflection of artillery flashes, their engines growling as they powered through currents that should have swept them away. "Schwimmwagen," the observer said, using the German intelligence term. The amphibious trucks from the reports. But the reports had said 50 to 100 vehicles in the entire theater. What Model was watching appeared to be hundreds, all moving simultaneously, dispersed across a front so wide that no single defensive position could engage them all. They weren't clustered at predictable crossing points. They were everywhere. The first DUKWs reached the eastern bank at 2,115 hours, several hundred yards south of Model's position. He watched through his glasses as they emerged from the water without pause, their wheels finding traction on the muddy bank, their engines roaring as they climbed the slope and disappeared inland. Each vehicle carried 25 fully armed troops, men who weren't exhausted from rowing assault boats, who weren't soaked and vulnerable, who were arriving with their equipment intact and ready to fight. No bridgehead to attack. No boats shuttling back and forth. No engineers exposed while constructing pontoons. The Americans weren't crossing the Rhine. They were driving through it. Model reached for his radio, but the words wouldn't come. What was he supposed to report? That trucks were swimming across the river? that his carefully prepared defensive fires were useless because there were no predictable crossing points to target, that American infantry were arriving in numbers his intelligence briefings said was impossible. All positions, this is Hawk Command, he finally transmitted. We have mass crossing in progress. Vehicle-borne infantry. Multiple landing points. Engage targets of opportunity. The response was immediate chaos. Other observers along the line reported the same phenomenon. DUKWs were crossing everywhere, some making for obvious landing zones, others heading for unexpected sections of bank. German machine guns engaged them, but the vehicle's armor, modest though it was, deflected small arms fire. The 88mm guns, positioned to destroy bridges that never materialized, tried to track individual trucks, but there were too many moving too fast, dispersed across too wide a front. At 2,130 hours, the second wave entered the water. Then the third. The British 51st Highland Division was crossing the Rhine not in a desperate assault that would take hours and cost thousands of casualties, but in an orderly procession that resembled a logistical exercise more than a combat operation. General Lieutenant Alfred Schlemm, at 1st Parachute Army Headquarters, received the initial reports with disbelief that rapidly transformed into something approaching panic. His entire defensive concept was predicated on destroying bridgeheads before they could be reinforced. But there were no bridgeheads in the traditional sense. American and British troops were arriving continuously at multiple points, without the vulnerable pause that German doctrine depended on exploiting. "Where are the bridges?" he demanded of his operations officer. "Where are their crossing points?" "Sir, they're not using bridges. They're using the amphibious trucks. Hundreds of them."
Impossible.
Intelligence said. Intelligence was wrong, sir. By midnight, over 12,000 Allied troops had crossed the Rhine in DUKWs. Not a single pontoon bridge had been constructed. Not a single assault boat had shuttled back and forth under fire. The crossing that German defenders expected would take days, if it succeeded at all, was essentially complete in under 3 hours. Major Model, watching the endless procession of vehicles emerging from the darkness, wrote a final entry in his command log. "The river has been rendered irrelevant. Our entire defensive concept is obsolete." The sound of DUKW engines, grinding through water and up the muddy banks, continued through the night. It was the sound of 2,000 years of military history becoming meaningless. By dawn on March 24th, German commanders along the Rhine confronted a reality their doctrine had no answer for. There were no bridgeheads to counterattack. The traditional German response to river crossings, mobile reserves smashing into vulnerable formations before they could consolidate, required a target. But Allied forces hadn't concentrated at predictable crossing points. They had dispersed across the entire front, delivered by vehicles that continued to swim back and forth with supplies, reinforcements, and equipment. Major Hans-Georg Model attempted to organize a coherent defensive response, but the situation devolved faster than he could process it. At 1,000 hours, as he prepared to reposition his remaining forces, the sky filled with aircraft. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, dropped 16,000 British and American paratroopers directly behind German defensive positions. The psychological impact was devastating. Model's troops, already disoriented by the previous night's amphibious assault, now found themselves surrounded. Paratroopers to their rear, amphibious forces to their front. And still the DUKWs kept coming, an endless stream of vehicles delivering fresh troops, artillery, ammunition, everything the textbooks said couldn't be sustained without established bridgeheads. "We are fighting ghosts," Model wrote in his diary that afternoon. "The Americans appear everywhere simultaneously. Our doctrine assumes they must consolidate, must establish supply lines, must pause to bring forward heavy equipment. But they pause for nothing. The trucks that swim have made our calculations meaningless." Oberst Hermann Krebs, The intelligence officer who had dismissed DUKWs as coastal logistics vehicles spent March 24th frantically compiling reports that contradicted every assessment he'd ever made. His afternoon situation report to Army Group Headquarters was a chronicle of disbelief. Enemy amphibious capability vastly exceeds all previous estimates. Vehicle count now assessed at 2,000 plus in theater. Continuous crossing operations maintained without bridging equipment. Conventional defensive doctrine ineffective against dispersed, vehicle-borne assault. The collapse wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. German officers trained in the Wehrmacht's methodical, doctrine-driven approach to warfare found themselves unable to respond to an enemy that had simply bypassed the fundamental assumptions of river defense. There were no rules anymore.
No predictable patterns.
No vulnerable phases to exploit. By evening, Model received orders to withdraw. But withdraw to where? The Americans were already inland, their DUKWs racing forward with supplies faster than German forces could retreat. What followed the Rhine crossing wasn't a battle, it was a chase. Allied forces, sustained by the continuous flow of DUKWs shuttling supplies across the river, advanced faster than retreating German forces could establish new defensive lines. The swimming trucks became logistical lifelines, delivering ammunition to forward units, evacuating casualties back across the Rhine, and maintaining supply chains that should have been impossible without established bridgeheads. Within 48 hours, American armored divisions had penetrated 30 miles into Germany. The DUKWs adapted to every terrain, every challenge. Rivers that German planners assumed would slow the Allied advance became minor obstacles, crossed in hours by vehicles that required no engineering preparation. The Lippe River, the Weser. Each waterway that should have bought days of delay was neutralized by trucks that simply drove through. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined through years of warfare, proved obsolete within a week. German defensive planning had always assumed time to prepare positions, time to move reserves, time to respond to enemy movements. The DUKWs eliminated time as a factor. They moved troops and supplies so rapidly that German forces were perpetually behind the operational tempo, perpetually reacting to situations that had already evolved beyond their response capability. Major Model surrendered on April 18th with the remnants of his unit, surrounded by American forces that had outpaced every withdrawal attempt. In his final diary entry, he wrote, "We were not defeated by superior tactics or overwhelming force. We were defeated by vehicles we never imagined could matter. The Rhine was supposed to buy us weeks. It bought us hours. And the trucks that swam kept swimming." Decades later, veterans from both sides would reflect on the Rhine crossing with a shared sense of historical irony. The battle that was supposed to be one of the war's bloodiest operations instead became a testament to industrial imagination triumphing over military tradition. A British veteran of the 51st Highland Division recalled, "We expected hell. We expected casualties like Normandy. But we just drove across. It felt almost anticlimactic. Until you realized that's exactly why it worked." Gunther Blumentritt, the German chief of staff who had dismissed American amphibious capabilities, provided perhaps the most honest assessment in his post-war memoir. "We studied their tanks, their aircraft, their artillery. We prepared for everything we understood as warfare. But we failed to imagine that they would simply engineer away our advantages. The Rhine wasn't crossed. It was dismissed as irrelevant. And we had no doctrine for that." The DUKW amphibious truck, designed by committee, built by the thousands, dismissed by intelligence analysts as logistical excess, had rendered Germany's last great natural barrier into a speed bump. Not through brilliance or heroism, but through the quiet devastation of industrial capability applied to tactical problems. The war in Europe didn't end with a dramatic assault against fortified positions. It ended with swimming trucks driving through history's final barricade, carrying troops who arrived dry, equipped, and ready to continue advancing before defenders could even comprehend what had happened. 2,000 years of military certainty, obsolete in 3 hours. That was the legacy of the DUKW. Proof that imagination, when backed by industrial scale, could rewrite the rules of warfare faster than any army could adapt.